Got it. Thank you, Scott, and welcome everyone. Uh, Sometimes we've had these on beautiful afternoons, and somehow this seems like a perfect day to spend an afternoon with George. So we are so honored to have him as our speaker today. We started these lectures about roughly two and a half years ago. So Mary and Friends meeting, built in 1695. It's a National Historic Landmark, and we have been working on a fundraising capital campaign to do a planning project to look at all the buildings on our campus, including the 1695 Meeting House, in order to determine what needs to be done to preserve it for the next 324 years. One of the things that people often think that with historic buildings, well, they've stood for 300 years, they'll easily stand for another 300 years. Well, it doesn't really work that way, that you really have to take an active approach. So we were fortunate enough on the third try to receive a $25,000 Pennsylvania and Historical Museum Commission grant for the planning project. And that should be done next month. And with that, we will have a roadmap for the next 10, 15 years, 20 years, hopefully, for all of the preservation projects that we'll need to do. And then we've already started our phase 2 in our capital campaign to raise the money to actually do the work. The 90,000 we've just raised was just to do the planning project. So I'm sure everybody who has an older home understands the dilemmas that we all face. So we started the Know Thy Neighbor lecture series as part of the outreach for the capital campaign. And we brought in initially our historic preservation architect, Dan Campbell, who's with us today, as our first speaker. And we've expanded it to people talking about historic preservation in general. And then we expanded it even further. We thought, well, what a great outreach approach this is, and we started to include social justice topics. So Laura Jackson has been working with us and finding different speakers, including George Lakey today. So thank you, Laura, for all the work you've done helping us expand this outreach approach that we're doing. And we're looking to build our meeting to have a bigger footprint in the community. Quakers do such a great amount of work in this world, and there aren't very many of us. But that's because we are so strong in our beliefs and putting beliefs into action. And certainly George Lakey is the epitome of living a life of putting his beliefs into action. Usually I cut down the speakers' bios, and make them short and sweet. But in George's case, I think I want to just share with you everything that he has done because, well, you'll see. He started in the late 50s. He was active in the Ban the Bomb movement and then the Civil Rights Movement. In 1963, he was arrested in a sit-in. The following year, he was a trainer for the Mississippi Freedom Summer and co-authored his first book, A Manual for Direct Action, which was widely used in the South by the Civil Rights Movement. In 1966, he co-founded the national body, a Quaker Action Group, whose activities took him in 1967 to Vietnam to participate in the sailing ship Phoenix's protest action in South Vietnam, seeking to give medical supplies to the anti-war Buddhist movement there. In 1970, he was active in the successful direct action in the Puerto Rican struggle to stop the US Navy from using the island of Culebra for target practice. In 1971, he helped found the Movement for a New Society, a network of autonomous groups working for nonviolent revolutions. The network's training program at the Philadelphia Life Center Association became highly influential in the US and abroad in spreading popular education and other participatory training methods. In 1973, George came out publicly as a gay man and joined the LGBT movement, becoming part of the gay liberation's early visionary days. During the 70s, he also gave national leadership to the campaign to stop the B-1 bomber and promote peace conversation, which succeeded in persuading Congress and President Carter to defund this Air Force program. In 1976, he co-organized Men Against Patriarchy in pioneering anti-sexism movement for men. In 1982, he organized the Pennsylvania section of a national labor community coalition named Jobs with Peace and directed that effort for 7 years. In 1991, he co-founded Training for Change, building on previous training at the Martin Luther King Jr. School for Social Change and Movement for a New Society. Training for Change developed a new pedagogy called direct education and did trainings and consultations for activists and non-governmental organizations in 20 countries. And it goes on. In 2009, George co-founded the Earth Quaker Action Team to build a just and sustainable economy through nonviolent direct action campaigns. And the group won its first campaign forcing PNC Bank to stop financing mountaintop removal of coal mining in Appalachia. George, then in his 70s, he was arrested and also led a 200-mile march. His first teaching post in higher education was at the Martin Luther King Jr. School of Social Change, a division of the Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, and he helped formulate the curriculum and then taught there for its first 4 years in the late 60s. He joined the Peace Studies program at the University of Pennsylvania and successfully expanded its undergraduate offerings and the participation of minority students. In addition, he helped lead the University of Pennsylvania Group Dynamics Lab promoting innovation, feminist leadership, and he also taught peace studies at Haverford College. He later taught at Temple University and was the Eugene M. Lang Visiting Professorship in Social Issues for Change at Swarthmore College, and he continued teaching at Swarthmore as the Lang Professor and then Research Professor until his retirement. In 2010, he was named as the National Peace and Justice Societies Association Peace Educator of the Year. Wow. George, what an amazing life you've had. And more than anyone I can think of, George has lived a life of putting his beliefs into action. So we will start with our video. Scott, if you can roll it, please.
When I was 19, I loved walking on that beach, especially when I needed alone time. Something that was very much on my mind the previous year and coming to a head was, what's my life about? Yes, I want to be a teacher. That seems like a great way to make a living, but what's my life really about? And it really came to a head one night. I walked for hours and hours on that beach, just back and forth, looking at the sea, looking at me, and asking God, what am I really centrally to do? And the message became clear as crystal that my life was to be about social change.
About the climate crisis, and there's a reason for standing right here, because this bank is, believe it or not, financing the development of fossil fuels. It's one thing to do something that you think might be a harm in 200 years, but to do something that's harming us right now, we don't even have to wait to find out from the scientists, is this a problem? They are creating the problem right now by financing the problem.
What didn't make my family unique? My dad is gay. My mom is from Norway, so she's an immigrant. My parents adopted my brother and sister. They're African American. My parents are white. I was the big surprise that showed up. And we lived in a collective household, 11 people in one house, an intentionally feminist community. We're Quakers. There were just a lot of ways that almost every issue of America or American families got expressed in our family.
Keep it in the ground! I've been on a grandparents' walk for climate justice. We're here at Independence Hall because so many good things started here, as well as some things that are problematic. We're having to create a new country, really.
No more fossil fuels!
I've made grievous errors in my life. I'm a mixed bag like anybody else, and like my country is. So I'd like to give my country the complicated view that I give myself, at the same time as acknowledging that we fall short.
My dad was the one that was always out of gallivanting around the world doing something. But it was like, I always knew that I felt like he was fighting for right, whatever right is.
You're not wanting them to see you as, oh, we're activists. We've seen activists. You're wanting to convey, we're grandparents. Oh, this is about image convey. And the rocking chairs really support you.
George knows what he's doing. He knows how to work with rebels. And I was a rebel, and I was ready to burn it to the ground. It's not enough to just be right or wrong, or to be angry or not. You have to actually convince other people to join you in resisting. And it was the first time in my entire life that any teacher or educator had ever taught me how to be a better rebel.
My dad is such a good Quaker. He's such a good Quaker. What does it mean to be a good Quaker, right? It's really about the, like, what is my purpose? What am I here to do? And how do I do that with integrity? And how do I do it leaning on spirit? So it's not about an ego trip. It's not about, like, how do I get on the front page? It's really about, like, what is spirit calling on me to do?
The yacht Phoenix, a self-ordained mercy ship manned by a crew of determined American pacifists. Its mission, to bring medical supplies to the North Vietnamese port of Hai Phong, despite Red Cross warnings and without State Department clearance.
A sailboat is also a romantic thing, and the fact that it was 8 people against the might of the American Empire. You know, there was something very, very Robin Hood about it, I think. I found myself led by spirit to offer myself for the next voyage. It would sail from Hong Kong to South Vietnam. This leading to join the voyage was very strong. It felt like God was tapping me on the shoulder.
This is George Lakey, reporting on my little escapade. After Harry went into the water and was picked up by 610, the Navy vessel 610, I jumped into the water and swam over.
The clarity of the summons didn't stop me from thinking about consequences, of course.
There are at least 4 guys in the water after George. Oh boy. They've got him surrounded now.
I'm human. I want to live a long life, and certainly not die in my 20s in an ocean halfway around the world. I thought about young people slain in the civil rights movement, and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and so many other movements where activists surely wanted to die as little as I did. And for that matter, my dad's brother in the Navy during World War II, and others in the armed forces of the world who don't make it back alive. I think I'm no one special in that life and death way. All of us have a responsibility to believe in something larger than ourselves, something so important that we're willing to die for it, if that's what it takes. Here I am, 83.
He's lived this incredibly courageous, big life that his parents could never have imagined for him. And I think in some ways the largest impact has been on the number of people he's trained. He's trained thousands of people from around the world who have in turn trained others and led movements and campaigns and been teachers and all of this thing. So it's like, that's a very big boulder in a lake to make a huge, all the ripples that we can't even see.
The value of the ripple effect of training when you're doing it well is that folks stick around in the movement and continue to provide offerings. And they don't look like George Lakey, they don't do trainings like George Lakey, but they certainly would describe themselves as influenced by. And that's what you really want. You don't want mimicry, you want new ways, new styles, folks that have their own lingo and rhythm and rhyme.
The wild card here is the behavior of the police, because if police jump on you over and over and over, there's a point where anybody can crack.
Sir, you need to respect our
We are soldiers in the army. We gotta fight, although we gotta cry. We gotta hold up the freedom banner. We gotta hold it up until we die. It's a great song, isn't it? True marching song.
Well, thank you very much. That's great, a great introduction to George. So George, if you'd like to unmute yourself and take over.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Am I coming across? Let's see, I unmuted
Yes,
myself.
yes,
Probably
yeah,
there's
that's
something
fine,
else.
George.
Is
We
that
can hear
good?
you.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I really appreciate this chance to share this afternoon. And watching that trailer is something. They say just before we die, our life flashes before us. I think this is a little early. Thank you. It's a little early. Anyway, really glad to be here. And I want to confess right out to the biggest professional mistake I ever made in my life. I don't know if it's clear that I was trained in graduate school to be a sociologist, and sociologists have a tendency to obsess about any system you present to them, whether it's a family system, school system, whether it's a business, whether it's a whole society. And I was looking at our society a dozen years ago, and I was starting to fret because what I saw was increased polarization, non-listening to each other, violence was showing up and so on. And this was a dozen years ago. It wasn't on the scale that it is now. I was seeing it starting, and I was starting to worry because I figured, well, how do you get anything done if people can't even understand each other? People can't even talk with each other and dialogue. And so I was worried about that. However, at the same time, I was researching for the book that I was working on at that time, which has come to be called Viking Economics. This is what it looks like. And this book, I wanted to write not only about the current system that the Nordics have put together, which some people have said, well, that's the American dream crossing the Atlantic back to Europe, because they have it so much more. They've realized American values so much more fully than the U.S. has, and that's pretty true. They're way at the top of this of the various statistics on national well-being and personal well-being for the people within them. And I was curious, though, not only to describe that, I was especially curious to know, how did they get there? Because a century ago, they were a mess, frankly. A century ago, Norwegians were coming here, and Canada, Swedes were coming, Danes. People were trying to get out of town because it was so miserable and oppressive, and so much poverty, so much lack of opportunity there. And now it's the other way around. So I wanted to know, how did they make their transition? Maybe there's a clue or two in how they made their transition that we could borrow. I'm totally happy to borrow from anybody who is successful in something. So I looked carefully at their history, and I was shocked. What I discovered was that they made their great leap forward in the 1920s and the 30s. They made their big leap forward at exactly the time when they were the most polarized that they had been in modern times. That made no sense to me. I was looking at the US with apprehension, thinking polarization is a terrible thing. But over there, polarization coincided with their big leap forward. I couldn't accept that. So I started thinking, other case studies, George, we need other case studies. And of course, immediately I thought about the United States. Well, in the United States, in the 1930s, which is the decade when I was born, in the 1930s, we experienced enormous polarization. The Madison Square Garden was filled by Nazis celebrating Nazism in the 30s. And at the same time, in the same decade, it was the glory period of the American Communist Party. The Ku Klux Klan was strong. It was a mess. Lots of violence, lots of humongous amounts of conflict and lack of communication. And the 1930s was the decade of the greatest progress that we made in the first half of the 20th century. Now I'm even more bewildered. So I have to keep thinking, keep looking for cases, right? So I fast forward in our country to the 1960s, which actually overlapped a bit with the 70s. What did we have in the 1960s? Some of you will remember. Tremendous degree of conflict. Rebirth of the American Nazi Party. Ku Klux Klan going wild, bombing churches, killing people left and right. And at the same time, on the left, a lot of left activity, including some things going on in California that they don't want to talk about anymore. Just a tremendous split, huge conflict, parents not talking to their children because their children are saying, we won't go to Vietnam, we won't allow ourselves even to be drafted to fight in Vietnam, and the parents saying, but your dad was a patriot, your dad fought in World War II, and so on and so on. Tremendous conflict. And the 1960s and 70s was a period of the greatest progress that we made in the second half of the 20th century. Okay, so I'm having to concede, as a professional who actually pays attention to evidence, I have to concede that polarization sometimes goes along with forward progress. But I'm still having trouble wrapping my mind fully around that. Okay, by that time, I was book touring in Britain for this book, because the Brits are fascinated with what goes on across the North Sea and how it is that they could improve their country by aping some of the things that the Nordics do. And so I was, it was a tremendously exciting book tour. At one point, I was being given hospitality by a Quaker who happened to be an artist who had recently transitioned from the art he was doing before to doing art with metal. And I was wandering around his beautiful house, looking at these gorgeous, gorgeous art objects of metal. And I said to him, how do you do this? Metal doesn't want to do what you want to do. How do you get metal to be like this? And he said, oh, let me show you, George, come on. So we go out through the kitchen into the backyard. He shows me his studio, proudly opens the door, and there in the studio is this gigantic forge. He said, yeah, I had to apprentice to a blacksmith to learn how to work with a forge. Because you're right, metal doesn't want to do what I want it to do. I have to heat it, and then I can do what I want to do. I said, thank you. What a relief. At last, I've got a metaphor that enables me, at least, to come to terms with the reality of polarization. Polarization is a forge. It heats up society. It makes things that before had been rigid quite melty, quite sticky, even molten. That's what a forge does to metal. That's what polarization does to a society. And that's why it was possible for the Nordics to use their highly polarized time when communists were marching in the streets and Nazis were marching in the streets in Norway and Sweden and Denmark. It enabled them to use that time in order to make their leap ahead. And it enabled us in our country to do the same in the 1930s and the 1960s and looping into the 70s. Well, another thing that's very like a forge is that polarization doesn't care what the outcome is. A forge couldn't care less if you are a blacksmith making horseshoes with the metal, or if you're an artist making art, or if I had to work with a forge, I would make junk, right? Forge doesn't care, happy to oblige, whatever. And that's the same that's true of polarization. Polarization couldn't care less what you make out of the heated up institutions, rules, norms of the society. So, for example, at the very time that the Nordics were leaping ahead, the Germans were experiencing severe polarization, and they went to Hitler and the Nazis. At the same time, as in Italy, also hugely polarized in the 30s, 20s and 30s, they went to Mussolini and the fascists. Polarization doesn't care. All polarization does, just like a blacksmith's forge, all that polarization does is makes it possible to make greater gains than at other times when society is more coherent and institutions are more solid and norms are more frozen. That's the difference. And for me, that has been on my mind every time I get the opportunity to speak to an audience. I was wrong about polarization. And so what I want to admit as a sociologist is, please take another look at what polarization means as you look at the surrounding opportunities and challenges that we face. Now, I'm in no way, I've got a big heart, I'm in no way wanting to minimize the amount of pain, the amount of hurt, the disrupted associations that previously had been friendly for years, the deaths that accompany polarization. I don't want to minimize that at all. I suppose if metal had an opinion, it would say, we don't want to be in the forge. Right. So it's not that we have to like polarization in the sense of overlook the pain and anxiety and disrupted relationships that happen as a result of polarization. We don't have to like that aspect of it. But to dislike polarization so much so that we wouldn't even use it as the opportunity it gives, especially in the light of the climate change that is so widely predicted and is already happening, and the climate crisis that is upon us, especially in the light of that, would we want to spend our time feeling our pain about polarization and not using this as an opportunity to maximize the chance that our great-grandchildren or our grandchildren have at least some decent future to look forward to? I myself have 6 great-grandchildren. I'm fighting for climate justice because the stakes are enormous for those great-grandchildren. In fact, they're even enormous for my grandchildren. In fact, they're even enormous for us. And not to use opportunity because we don't like what goes with opportunity would be, I think, something we would be very, very sad to do if we continue to do that. I also want to actually read a bit of the book, which tries to put not only my professional mistakes forward, but also put forward what some of the struggle has been like in my life, some of the glories of the struggle that I've been lucky to participate in through participation in social movements. And also, I want to do this because I'd like to give you the flavor of the book, because some of you might like to pick it up and read it for yourselves. In fact, some people are already forming study groups because they're finding it more fun to read together. But it reads fine as it is. So this short bit that I'll read right now is from 1964, height of the Civil Rights Movement, Mississippi summer. In June 1964, I joined the Freedom Summer training staff in Ohio for the first week's batch of nearly 500 volunteers. These were student volunteers from colleges around the North. It was my first chance to work with the Reverend James Lawson, who had studied Gandhi's work in India before training the founding leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. In Ohio, we relied heavily on role plays, giving participants nonviolent combat training to orient them to the conflicts that they might encounter when they went to Mississippi. The staff included a number of SNCC workers, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee workers, who were fresh from the field in Mississippi. At the end of the week, I watched the students board the buses headed for the South. After a day to debrief and relax, the training staff welcomed another batch of hundreds of volunteers. We approached 1,000 actual volunteers that summer. On the second day of the second week, we were all called to the college auditorium. The students from the first week were already distributed around Mississippi. I found a seat in the second row of the auditorium along with others on the training staff, guessing we would get a progress report. But when a federal official who'd been observing the training came to the center of the stage, he appeared upset. He looked around, then stared at the paper he had placed on the rostrum. We've just received word that 3 of the Freedom Summer workers are missing together in Mississippi: James Cheney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Cheney was a SNCC field organizer. Goodman and Schwerner were student volunteers. I was stunned. Cheney, along with other SNCC organizers, had been at high risk for months, I knew. But Goodman and Schwerner had been here in our training the previous week, volunteers like the students sitting around me, and they might already be dead. Looking around, I wondered what the students were imagining. How many of them would quickly return to the northern suburban homes that many of them had come from? Over the next few days, along with our training, I watched the SNCC workers take on the role of older siblings to these frightened students. We built an invincible container strong enough to hold the shock and grief and fear that rocked our training. Under the old trees of the campus, stories and listening, freedom songs and prayers were shared. Very few students went home. At the end of the training, most got on the buses and took their turn to head toward Mississippi. SNCC's 1964 campaign turned out to be one of the boldest and most brilliant strategic moves of the entire civil rights movement, with lessons for today. Their primary target was the federal government, led by a Democratic administration highly reluctant to support racial integration in the South. SNCC joined Bayard Rustin, Dr. King, and others in believing that federal pressure was needed to force change, and it worked. Bayard Rustin was one of the big influences on me, Quaker, Black leader in the civil rights movement. Okay, here's another one, quite different in character, this story. And this is about my daughter, Ingrid, when she was a youngster. Daddy, last night I had that terrible dream again. I looked at my 11-year-old with surprise. It was 1982. Ingrid and I were the first ones to the breakfast table this morning, and I was reading the morning paper. Our round wooden table usually accommodated 3 or 4 of our household members by now, busily chowing down on eggs and toast or granola. Tell me about your dream, I said to Ingrid. She was usually full of bounce and smiles, even in the morning, but at the moment she held a grave expression on her face. I dreamt that there were big bombers coming over our house. They made a lot of noise, so I thought I woke up, but I really didn't, because it was a dream, she explained. Uh-huh, I said. Then what happened? A big explosion went off down the street, and somebody yelled, "A nuclear bomb," and then I don't know what happened. She paused. But it was scary. It sure is, I agreed. Gee, you'd think with all that noise, I would have heard it too. Oh, Daddy, Ingrid laughed. Don't be silly. You can't hear somebody else's dream. I got up and put another slice of bread in the toaster. while reflecting on the impact of President Ronald Reagan's fear-mongering election campaign. Claiming that the United States would fall behind in the nuclear arms race was hokum, but Reagan, a B-list actor, had previously had a career selling himself on TV for General Electric. I wondered if he had any sense that what he was doing was continuing to bomb the resilience of American culture. Ingrid, you're not the only person having dreams about this stuff. You've heard the grown-ups talking about the dangers of nuclear war, and a lot of people are worried about it. Your mother and I are working on our country's leaders to reduce the danger. I want you to know that. And I have an idea about something you can do about fixing it. Ingrid eagerly leaned forward. I told her about the group of Haverford College students that I was coaching to organize a neighborhood diversity fair down the street at Clark Park. She had already met those students because I brought my Haverford College Peace Studies class on a field trip to my house to show them a sample of our Movement for a New Society lifestyle. And in our living room, Ingrid had responded to their questions about a child's view of our community. At semester's end, one of my students enlisted some of his Haverford College friends for the Diversity Fair's organizing team. The fair's goal was to provide a venue for neighborhood groups to come together to show off to each other, especially the minority groups among whom hostility simmered in our neighborhood. The Hmong residents promised to bring their crafts and dances. African-American groups promised soul food and drumming. Cambodians agreed to teach games and share music. And other groups promised a flea market and pony rides. Our city council representative agreed to come and give out free ice cream cones to all. The police department was nervous about bringing these groups together and at first insisted on a strong uniformed presence. We talked them out of that by promising to train peacekeepers who would circulate throughout the fair. The police ended up sending plainclothes officers instead. And so it was that Ingrid and her best friend, Evie Deming, also 11, found themselves at the Speak Out corner. For weeks, they had been rehearsing their speeches against nuclear arms. And now, while the Haverford students were speaking and gathering a crowd, Evie and Ingrid were arguing about who would go first. Both had gotten stage fright and wanted the other to start. How about this, I suggested. Both of you stand up together, and then Ingrid, you start, and Evie, you take your turn while you're both up there together. This proved acceptable. A visibly nervous Ingrid, freckles made even more visible by the summer sun, launched into her speech. The line I remember was, "I don't want any more scary dreams," which got the crowd's fervent applause. And the outcome of the fair that I remember best, even though exhausted student organizers and happy neighbors alike agreed it was a successful event, my big outcome was that Ingrid stopped having her nightmares. Funny thing, how taking action reduces anxiety. And now I get to find out what your questions are. And I'm very, very keen to find out what they are because I love dialoguing.
So I think what we can do is you could either post a question in the chat or if you, hopefully we won't all be talking over each other, but if you have a question and you want to just unmute yourself, feel free to do that as well. So whichever works best for you.
Scott or Ross, is it possible for me to see the questioner?
Well, when if somebody were to speak, it should their question should be or they should be on screen. Looks like Jim, you have a question, so why don't you go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question.
Hi, thank you for that, George. My name is Jim Wright, and I'm a Quaker, and I'm a Vietnam veteran. And I'm really conflicted about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the arms productions that are keeping the Ukrainians able to keep the Russians at bay. I don't know if you could talk about this and help me and others think through. I mean, I think about it in terms of, war's not the answer. On the other hand, I just find this to be such a horrific violation of the rights of people and of nations to live their lives. But I also worry so much about the hands of others stirring this up and the fog of war that surrounds this conflict. And I want to see a way through it that's actually real and practical and not imaginary. So maybe you could say a few words about how you think about the conflict in Ukraine.
Gandhi was important to me. I read a tremendous lot of Gandhi at one point in my life. And one of the things that stands out in this regard is his comment to someone who fought back when somebody attacked him, fought back violently when somebody attacked him. And then came to Gandhi later and said, did I do the wrong thing? And Gandhi said, look, if you can't think of a nonviolent way of dealing with that attack, it's better for you to fight back violently than simply to allow yourself to be hurt or to be taken advantage of. The most important thing is to refuse to go along with the oppression or the violence that's being imposed on you. But, said he, I believe and have found in my life, there always is a nonviolent alternative. And just because you didn't happen to think of it in that moment doesn't mean that you can't think of it in the next moment. And I go with that. It's impossible to predict anything so complex, of course, as international relations. But one thing that therefore, because I go with Gandhi on that and with Quakerism on that, I believe that Quakerism lines up with that. When the invasion first started of Ukraine, I did several Zoomed deals. One was an international deal, an international program on, do the Ukrainians have an alternative? And what I talked about was the Czechoslovak resistance to the Soviet invasion in 1968. And I talk about that in one of my books also, which was phenomenally successful, non-violently. And in that case, the leader of the country, Dubček, actually locked the troops in the barracks so they wouldn't even be allowed to fight back violently. And instead, of course, it was the people who rose up and fought back non-violently, and they were able to get a number of concessions from the Soviet Union, despite the fact the Soviet Union not only sent its own troops, but also other Warsaw Pact powers, right, got involved in it, tremendously overwhelming force. And nevertheless, the Czechoslovak people got some major concessions, important concessions to them, and then were able to, through every few years, episodic nonviolent campaign again, would keep widening the space, the political space, which is what they wanted. So I talked about that experience, which unfortunately has fallen out of people's memory banks, even if they were around in 1968. And then I go back even earlier, which nobody can remember, but I happen to know because I lived in Norway and studied there and so on, that the Norwegians and the Danes chose strikingly different strategies in opposing German Nazi invasion in 39-40, with the Norwegians doing the customary thing, fight, and they lost ground, all the way up to the Arctic Circle, and they were defeated violently. horrible outcome in many, many ways. And then as compared with the Danish, whose government knew it had virtually no chance of winning against Germany, just as Norway didn't. And but in that situation, they said, let's do nonviolence instead. And so the government didn't put up any military resistance and relied on an underground-led nonviolent resistance that was able to cause major trouble with the German war effort, because the German war effort, of course, was multinational. So I go into all those things just to suggest that nation states actually can choose something else. Now, Zelensky already has chosen. After that initial discussion, when that was going on so excited in such an exciting way, and realized that the die was cast in Ukraine. I couldn't think of any way that any national leader would be able to say, on second thought, let's do nonviolent resistance. And so that's why Gandhi came to mind. It's one of those things. They weren't prepared, even though they've had two very successful overthrows of dictatorships recently, nonviolently. So it's in the skill set of Ukrainians to give a lot of trouble to oppressive governmental authority. Nevertheless, this time they weren't able to think that up, and what they thought up instead was the normative violent response, and that's what they've done. So I regarded myself as, if I continued along that line, which there were a number of invitations for me to continue to argue my case for nonviolence, I felt like that would be harassment. Do you know what I mean? Like, after somebody had made a clear choice to use violence and stake their whole game on violence, for me to run along at their heels yapping like a dog would be a mess. And it would be, I think, wrong, actually, for me to do that. So I just shut up, thinking, well, there's lots of other places in the world where there is opportunity for creative, innovative, nonviolent struggle. I'm going to focus my mind on that rather than upset myself too much with the Ukrainian choice, because they made a clear choice.
George,
Yes.
if you don't mind, forgive me. I just want to let folks know it is. We're not going to stop anything right now. We've got some questions lined up here, but if you need to step away at 3 o'clock, we're going to continue recording this through the Q&A session, and so if we go past 3 o'clock and you have to leave, you'll be able to see this recording later. George, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to another question. It looks like, is it Bridget? Did I say that right?
Yes.
Oh, good.
I've known George in years past and known him to be a person who can see opportunities. And I wondered what opportunities he saw for us in the current polarization in this country.
Oh, so many opportunities. So the most recent one I thought of, and it's very excited about, of course, because it's recent, right, is that we form nonviolent direct action campaigns to take the power away from the medical and I don't know what even to call it, medical / corporate / financial powers basket, and institute and press for something like socialized medicine for our country. And the reason why that's an opportunity is that there are so many Trump voters who are in trouble, medically speaking, because many of those people are working class people who don't have great insurance, whose hospitals are deserting them. There's this closure of rural hospitals throughout the Midwest and the country, really. A lot of hospitals that haven't quite closed yet have shut down their maternity ward. What is it like to be a pregnant woman knowing that she has to then go to a metropolitan center 5 hours away if she gets in trouble with regard to childbirth? Think of the number of Trump voters who have people in their family whose whose retirement is insecure, who don't have pensions. We have a country unforgivably sentencing older people to poverty in massive numbers in the working class. And many of those people, the children of those old people are voting for Trump because they're not getting what they need from the Democrats. So they can at least trash somebody, right? Because they're so angry. But what if we didn't depend on the Democrats either? Instead, that we created mass movements that pressed very, very hard and insisted upon and created dislocation in such a way that finally they agreed that we could have the medical system that Harry S. Truman as president wanted in 1946. That's what we deserve. We needed it in 46. He knew that, and we need it even more today. And I'm all for sit-ins in CVSs all over the country. You know, you'll see in my book How We Win so many delicious examples of how nonviolent direct action has come through for past movements, such that they've been able to get stuff that in the beginning cynics said, oh, you'll never get that, you'll never get that, you'll never get that, right? And they got it because they knew how to press through nonviolent direct action. That means dislocation. That means taking away the ability of the status quo to just swim along while the rich are getting richer, 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 and the poor are getting poorer. And that can be stopped. This book tells how.
So it looks like we have a question from Jennifer Elam. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, George.
Hi.
Well, my very first workshop ever as a Quaker was your workshop in Washington, D.C. in the middle of a snowstorm in 1995.
That was really fun.
You remember, isn't that good?
You felt so brave.
I came from Kentucky there. I was kind of blown away. And shortly after that, I moved to Pennsylvania, first at Pendle Hill. And then I rode with you to lots of places you might remember. I'm remembering that you're from the South, as I am. Is that right?
No, I'm not actually.
Oh,
I'm a Pennsylvania boy.
You're Pennsylvania. Well, anyways, my question is still the same. I've never seen you advocate for Appalachians, and why is that? And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to put some energy into that, since I see Appalachians as one of the groups in the country that need advocacy right now more than just about anybody.
I so much agree. And that's one of the reasons why the first campaign the Earthquaker Action Team embarked upon was mountaintop removal coal mining in Appalachia. And we devoted 5 years of very, very strong effort to that. And we succeeded because we were able to nail the bank. The thing about blowing up a mountain in order to get coal, as you know, is that it takes a lot of capital. Because instead of hiring local workers, you're just blowing stuff up, but you need to pay for the stuff you use to blow up mountains. And blowing up a mountain, I mean, think what that is. So we went down there and talked with Appalachian people, saw what former mountaintops now looked like, which were devastation, right? And we said, we want to help you folks out. So in profound solidarity with Appalachian people, we worked 5 years. And we started in Philly with PNC Bank, and then we were able to branch out to Delaware and Maryland, and then New Jersey. And then we were able, by the time 5 years had gone along, because we started in a living room, frankly, in my living room. We were a small group, right? And by the time we'd reached 13 states, we could get invasions of PNC banks in 13 states simultaneously. When we'd reached that point of coordination and had shut down 2 of their shareholders meetings, their national shareholders meetings, by the time we'd gotten to that point of expression of power, they said, okay, we give up. So the 7th largest bank in the country, which is what PNC was, 7th largest bank in the country, gave up because a little group of direct action Quakers using the tools that 17th century Quakers used against the Puritans in Massachusetts, using those tools, we forced the seventh largest bank to give up mountaintop removal coal mining. And one of the benefits of choosing that campaign, as you will appreciate especially, is that we got to go back and forth and visit with Appalachian sisters and brothers, and they came up and so on. So we worked in a kind of collaborative way.
Thank you. You know, the only time I ever saw my daddy cry in my life was when we talked about mountaintop removal. And the mountain next to my grandpa's property in the mountains is gone. and it's devastating. It's really devastating. So I appreciate those efforts. We need some more though. You want to do some more work down there? We need you.
Well, I do describe it in this book, hoping that more people will pick up on it and do it, because, you know, I wish I could organize everybody in the country, but that's hopeless. So people have to learn from each other. And that's how I learned, right? I learned as a kid, you know, as a teenager, from others who had gone before. Yeah.
So,
thanks, George.
You're welcome.
So it looks like we might have time for one more question. And I know through the chat, there was a question from Janet. If you want to unmute and ask your question, or.
Okay, sure. I was just wondering how George explained the violence that arose in Denmark in 1943 with people burning Nazi buildings, Nazi houses, and killing Nazis. I mean, they were the enemy, they were the occupiers, but I just wondered how he explained that. Did the movement fall apart in 1943? Did they get tired of having been occupied for so long, or was there another explanation? Thank you.
Well, I haven't done interviewing in Denmark, although I did do interviewing in Norway about their period. I didn't do interviewing in Denmark, but my understanding is that they paid a price in Denmark for not knowing that there's such a thing as principled nonviolence. You know, that is, they understood that a lot of the tactics, specific tactics that are nonviolent. For example, workers in factories would say, "Whoop, 4 o'clock, we have to leave early, we have to leave work early because our gardens have to be watered or we're in big trouble when it's time for us to eat vegetables. So we're out of here." And in that way, refused the Nazis' orders that they work till 8 p.m. and that kind of thing. So there was tons of brilliant improvisation, but you need, as Dr. King knew so well, it's great to have creativity and improvisation, but it's also great to have a strategic commitment to nonviolent struggle, because that sees you through the angry times. And there will be angry times because we're up against enemies that will do us in, if you know, are already doing us in. And it's, what could be more natural than to be angry? I'm angry a lot. I cry a lot. I have a big heart, so I cry a lot about what's going on. My family will tell you they see me crying over the morning newspaper, and that's because there's so much heartache in the news of things that could be easily avoided, hurts that could be easily avoided if the economic elite would let go of its control and allow this to be a democracy. We could have those things. So. But I get angry when I see also an economic elite acting like, well, the equivalent in Denmark in 43 would be watching Nazis operate the way they do, right? So you get furious with them, and then you want to do violence. And what could be more natural? And I'm alive to the ability to use violence. Gandhi said, actually, it's handy to know that you can do violence, and then you know that you have additional disciplines to take, additional prayers to make, additional solidarity to experience in order to overcome the natural human wish to be angry at those who do wrong. And so that's what I do. So I have yet to be violent in situations. I've had knives pulled on me. I've been beaten up by a gang of tough youngsters tough young men, who disagreed with a peace stand I was taking and so on. I've experienced a lot of violence toward me, and I've never done violence back, but I have the capacity to do that. And I understand that. So a very cool thing about my deep Quaker commitment to nonviolence is that it supports me to rule that out, not even to be creative about how clever I could be in being violent back. The Danes didn't have that. They didn't have a Quaker testimony. They didn't have Gandhi giving leadership. And so they were vulnerable to violent acting out in response. And I'm sorry for that. On the other hand, they deserve full credit for the tremendous amount of nonviolence that they did manage to pull off, which enabled them, by the way, to save almost all Danish Jews from the Holocaust. And Norway, to contrast those two, since they're so alike in many ways, the Norwegians, who resisted violently with the troops and so on, were not able to save the Jews, the Norwegian Jews, from the Holocaust, or were able to save very few. So the payoff of nonviolence is enormous, but it does take some self-discipline to be able to do that. And I'm confident that everyone listening to this and watching this has the ability to access the self-discipline to be able to handle themselves so they can engage in direct conflict and at the same time experience the joy side of it rather than experience the hate side of it.
So we have one last question, and I'm going to throw that one to Laura Jackson. So Laura, if you want to ask your question, and then I have just one last thing I want to share before I turn it over to Ross, who will close our afternoon session for us. Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, well, I'd like to return to the beginning of our time together, George, and the opening scene in the trailer for the documentary about your life when you were a young man asking the Spirit or asking God what your life was to be about, and waiting until you received, and I'm not clear exactly how you knew this is what you were being told, but there must have been times over the last years when you've come to that place again, or I'm wondering if there were, and you have to ask that question again, and if so, what has kept your relationship with the Spirit and the answer to that question alive over this long period of time?
Yes, I never came to a place of doubt of that. That commission was just as clear as crystal. It was like, what's my name, George Lakey? What's my commitment? When I became a Quaker, I started to call it a ministry. So I've fussed with what we call it, but the commitment has always been very, very clear. The question was, could I carry it out? And the problems involved in carrying that out, and also having a family, and also having other commitments. Yeah, so I haven't. I've been lucky that way. I haven't gone into a big questioning type struggle. And I think the reinforcement of the Society of Friends has been very important to me. And that's why when I'm out and about with young people, especially, and they ask me, gee whiz, how are you able to keep going, old man? I say, get with people, trusted people that you can hang with for a long time, preferably, which is what I did, because that solidarity, that support, that community becomes very, very important in sustaining our ability to do what we know is ours to do.
Great. Thank you so much, George. A couple things. One, if in the chat, I did post a link to Dancing with History. So it looks like it will be available in just a few days.
It's supposed to be in all the bookstores by December 6th. There was a supply chain problem. It was supposed to be November 15th. And the printing got messed up. And so now it's December 6th and it should be in all the bookstores.
Right. And then my other question is, when is the documentary going to be available?
That depends on funding. That depends on funding. Yeah, we've raised 225,000. The budget is 325,000. So we need that additional 100,000. Hope that person is on this call who in addition to giving to the Marion renewal has some money left over for the film. But anyway, yeah, a second, you might watch for a second trailer because the filmmaker has accumulated so much additional footage. We've been doing a lot of great shoots, I guess they're called. This is all new to me. And he says he's going to produce another trailer. So that'll be fun to watch for on YouTube.
Great. We'll keep an eye out for that. So so thank you again, George. I'm going to turn it over to Ross, who will close out our afternoon together.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks for all your help with this, Scott. George, wow, what a life you've lived, and certainly an example for all of us about the power of putting your beliefs into action. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I encourage everyone, if you are so inclined and in such a position, to go to our website and make a donation to our preservation campaign to preserve Marion Friends meeting for the future. And also, please join us any Sunday morning at 11 for our meeting for worship in person, or also we have the hybrid meetings that are Zoom, and the link is on our website at marionfriends.org. Is it Marion Friends? So thank you very much all for joining us. We had over 41 people, I believe, joining us today. A great turnout, and thank you, George, once again, and have a great afternoon.
Peace.
In peace, very much so. Thank you all.